everyone. My name is Daphna Shilveltesh, and I am Hasi Community's co-chair, along with Dr. Benu Natan. All of us here at the Community for Human Animal Studies Israel are very excited to start off the international part of our 6th annual conference. We're happy you joined us today and hope you are able to stay for the rest of today's and tomorrow's panels as well. The last 2 years have shed new light on the depths of humans' involvement in the world around them. As the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in quarantines in many countries, the ecosphere has experienced what has been termed an anthropause, which has significant and mixed effects on the environment and the myriads of creatures living in it. This year's theme wishes to examine the connection between the impacts of human action on the living beings around us during the Anthropocene and the interrelatedness of the private and the political and multi-species relations. The various panels focusing on issues such as violence, ethics, ecofeminism, and multi-species sites of engagement explore how numerous issues and concerns that seem personal and private, such as the choice to eat, wear, hunt, slaughter, raise and adopt animals, are both influenced by and determined on the basis of social, cultural, and political norms. I cannot think of anyone more suited to address the theme of the conference than our keynote speaker, Professor Jeff Sebo. I cannot possibly recount here all of his remarkable achievements and publications, but I will try to go over some of the main ones. Jeff Sebo is Associate Clinical Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU, where he's also affiliated Professor of Bioethics, Medical Ethics, Philosophy, and Law. He's also the founding director of one of the first animal studies MA programs in the United States. He's co-author of Chimpanzee Rights in Food, Animals, and the Environment, both published in Routledge 2018. His latest book, published this year and a definite must-read, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, Why Animals Matter for Pandemics, Climate Change, and Other Catastrophes, puts forth the argument that the current way we treat animals is not only ethically immoral, but also a grave danger to our health and survival. His current research focuses on the sentience and moral, legal, and political status of animals and AI. Jeff's work has influenced the work of many as well as my own over the years as he expanded our understandings of animal protection, rights, and ethics. We will now turn to Professor Sebo. You're welcome to jot down your thoughts and questions in the chat box during his talk, and we'll return to them in the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daphna, both for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate and for saying all of those very nice things about me in the introduction. I really, really appreciate all of it. Obviously, this is such an interesting and important and timely topic, and the fact that you made it the topic of your event this year is really wonderful. So thank you again for that, and everybody else for being here too and being part of the conversation. I'm honored to be able to talk with you about these important issues here today. So what I want to do is tell you why I think humans have substantial moral responsibilities to and concerning non-human animals in the Anthropocene. In other words, in a human world, a world reshaped by human activity. And in order to gesture at why I think we have substantial responsibilities to non-human animals, consider a simple case to get us started. So imagine you live in a house and you have a backyard, a very scenic backyard. Animals are wandering through your backyard. You see them through the window sometimes, but eventually you decide that you want to build a swimming pool. And so you start building a swimming pool. You start building a fence in order to keep the animals away, but the fence is still under construction. And then one day you wake up, you look out your window while sipping your coffee in the morning, and you see, to your horror, a fawn, a young deer, drowning in your swimming pool because they walked through a gap in your still incomplete fence. Now, what should you do in this situation? Do you have any kind of responsibility to save this drowning fawn, assuming that you can do so relatively safely? You might damage your clothes, you might be a little bit late to work, but nothing bad would happen to you beyond that. Now, I think in this kind of case, most of us would have the reaction that, yes, you should save this drowning fawn. Now, we might have different reasons for saying that. Some of us, the consequentialists, might say that because we think there is suffering happening here, unnecessary suffering happening here, and you have the power to do something about it. you have the power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant. So you should do that. Whereas others of us, the non-consequentialists, might say, no, you have this responsibility not just because suffering is happening in general, but because you are specifically complicit in or responsible for this suffering in particular. You performed an action with the foreseeable result that a fawn might fall in the pool and drown, and now this is happening. And so you have an obligation to save the fawn, to reduce and repair harm for which you are complicit, right? For which you are responsible. So we might have different reasons for thinking that you should save the fawn. Some of us think that we should do it to reduce suffering. Others of us think that we should do it to reduce our own complicity in harm. But either way, we agree that we should do it. Now, why does this matter? I think it matters because in the Anthropocene, increasingly many of our interactions with non-human animals will have that character. And that disrupts traditional ways of thinking about our moral responsibilities to other animals. So traditionally, in moral philosophy, when we think, for example, about our duties to wild animals, philosophers think either of two general things. First, the consequentialists think, consequentialists are people who think that morality is about the consequences. And they think we ought to intervene in and reduce wild animal suffering to the degree that we can do so effectively, because animals are suffering and dying unnecessarily all the time as a result of hunger and thirst and illness and injury and so on and so forth. And we have the power to do something about that potentially. And so we should explore options for reducing their suffering and improving their welfare. Whereas non-consequentialists, people who think that morality is about more than consequences, something like rights or virtues or relationships of care, non-consequentialists often say, no, we in fact should not intervene in wild animal suffering, try to reduce wild animal suffering, try to improve wild animal welfare. Because first of all, we have no responsibility to improve wild animal welfare. But second of all, we do have a responsibility to respect wild animal autonomy. So we have no duty to help wild animals. What we have a duty to do is leave them alone. And so not only are we not required to help them, but we are actually required not to help them because that would be a form of interference in their autonomy. Now, I think the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which human activity is a dominant force on this planet, I think the Anthropocene disrupts these arguments because it indicates how complex the world is and how human influenced the world is. And that means that these theories are going to increasingly converge, at least partially, meet in the middle, at least partially, in roughly the following way. Consequentialists, we want to reduce wild animal suffering, we want to improve wild animal welfare, but we also have to recognize that the world is complicated and we have significant limits on our knowledge and our power and our political will. And oftentimes when we intervene, it might help, but oftentimes it might harm. And so yes, we should generally be disposed to help when we can do it effectively, but we should also be aware that we might often not be able to do it effectively. And we need to approach this task with caution and humility. Whereas non-consequentialists need to acknowledge that to the degree that the world is increasingly shaped by human activity, we are increasingly complicit in and responsible for suffering and death all over the world, both in our species and in other species. There is no longer an opportunity to simply leave wild animals alone. That ship has sailed. We are intervening in their lives, interfering with their autonomy, whether we like it or not. And the only question is, are we willing to attempt to reduce and repair that harm to the degree that we can do so ethically and effectively? And so I think where we meet roughly in the middle is on the following idea. We should try to help wild animals, but we should also try to do that cautiously. We should try to do it humbly. We should try to do it in a way that respects their rights and cultivates virtuous character traits and cultivates relationships of care with them. And we should be mindful of the limits of our knowledge and power and political will. But with all of that said, at the end of the day, we should work towards building structures that allow us to treat them better and improve their welfare. So that is a rough moral framework that I think even if we have different starting points, some of us think we should reduce suffering, others of us think we should respect autonomy. Even if we have different starting points, we should meet there And we should accept that, yes, we should be careful, humble, cautious, respect rights, cultivate virtue, cultivate relationships of care, but we should also, to the degree that we can do it ethically and effectively, help. We should provide assistance because they are suffering, we can do something about it, and we are increasingly complicit in that suffering. So that is the moral framework that I believe we ought to build some kind of coalition around, even if we have different ethical theories and even if we have other disagreements. We can at least, I would like to think, agree on that, and then work together in order to pursue various policies that can be good for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. And that is what the rest of my talk will be about. So what I want to do now in the talk is focus on some examples of how human activity in the Anthropocene is not only harming and killing trillions of non-human animals per year directly, but also contributing to global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change, which in turn are impacting human and non-human animals alike. So we perpetrate violence against animals. That violence increases health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change. And then those threats increase risks for humans and non-humans, both directly and indirectly. And that will produce an argument that we have a moral responsibility to include animals in our health and environmental advocacy and policy by reducing our use of them as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts and increasing our support for them as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts. And we have a duty to do that not only for the sake of humans, but also for the sake of other animals. And we have a duty to do it holistically and structurally and comprehensively. So I want to make that argument and then explore what it might mean for global health and environmental policy frameworks like One Health, like the Green New Deal, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to close by suggesting some short-term policy changes that can be helpful in this respect, some policy changes we can pursue soon that can be good for humans and animals and the environment at the same time, as well as some longer term, more transformative policy changes that we should start thinking about and working toward. So that will be the arc of the talk from here. And then I hope there can be enough time for discussions too. So please do be thinking about what questions you want to ask or what comments or objections you want to make. And you can write those down in the chat and then we can be thinking about those during the discussion part. Okay, so what are we doing to animals? Well, hopefully for this audience, I will not need to belabor this part of the talk. Suffice to say, we are doing very bad things to animals. I can focus on three industries as brief illustrations: factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade. So as I expect we all know, factory farming is a global industry of industrial animal agriculture that is extraordinarily violent and oppressive against non-human animals. We breed animals to grow too big, too fast. Then we put them in these cramped, toxic environments with many other animals without room to engage in natural behaviors or socialize. We will mutilate them without anesthesia. We then transport them on hot, crowded trucks without access to water or veterinary care. And we then slaughter them on industrial disassembly lines that prioritize efficiency over anything like humane treatment of animals in the last moments of their lives. And we now do this to tens of billions of non-human animals per year, particularly at least 70 billion land animals and more than 100 billion aquatic animals every year live and die in this brutal, brutal way. Now that is many more animals per year than the total number of humans who have ever existed every single year in factory farming, not even considering all of the new forms of animal farming coming online, like octopus farming, insect farming, already killing 1 trillion animals per year, as many as 50 trillion by the end of this decade. Whole other story, okay. Deforestation, partly in order to clear land for factory farming and other animal agriculture. We are clearing forests all over the world. And not surprisingly, that is harming and killing and displacing non-human animals all over the world. Forests are the most biodiverse terrestrial regions on the world. And when we chop down all those trees We force animals from their homes. We often kill them directly. And keep in mind that we are not always clearing forests by chopping down trees. We are also often clearing forests by burning them, which is not good for all of their residents. And then the wildlife trade. The wildlife trade captures animals from the wild or breeds them in captivity, and then once again transports them across great distances and keeps them in captivity, and then slaughters them in ways that are not conducive to them living long and happy and flourishing lives. And if we count industrial fishing as part of the wildlife trade, then not only is this harming and killing tens of millions of animals per year, but an estimated 1 to 3 trillion. That is the number of animals estimated to be harmed and killed each year in the industrial fishing trade. Okay, so that is the violence that humans are perpetrating against non-human animals every year directly. I wish that was the end of the story. That would be bad enough, but the story is unfortunately only getting started. These industries are then contributing to global health and environmental threats that impact human and non-human animals alike. We can focus for illustration on 2 examples, pandemics and climate change. So first of all, consider how factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade can contribute to pandemics. So first of all, factory farming is generally bad for health. Again, raising animals in cramped, toxic environments, exposing the animals to sicknesses, exposing workers to sicknesses, exposing local community members to sickness. And then of course, to the degree that food is contaminated, exposing consumers and broader communities to sickness as well. But there are specific reasons why this is a threat for pandemics. When you put thousands of sick animals with weakened immune systems in cramped, toxic conditions, that is a perfect breeding ground for new pathogens, a perfect place for them to develop and spread. And when you then pump those animals full of antibiotics and other antimicrobials in order to suppress the spread of disease and stimulate growth, then not only is it the ideal breeding ground for pathogens, but is also the ideal breeding ground for antibiotic and antimicrobial resistant pathogens. And then global exchange can spread those pathogens all over the world. And that is why bird flu right now is such an alarming concern, resulting in cullings all over the world in bird farms, as one example. Okay. Now, deforestation also contributes to the risk of pandemics, because when we chop down forests, when we cut down forests, not only are we increasing interactions between humans and wild animals who might be carriers of infectious diseases, but we also reduce forested biodiversity, which functions as a buffer against the spread of diseases. When you have a more biodiverse area, then diseases will spread to other animals and to humans less rapidly. But when you diminish forested biodiversity, you can often facilitate a faster spread of disease across animal populations and then to humans, okay? And then the wildlife trade also, as I think we all know, can contribute to the risk of pandemics. Now, COVID-19 might or might not have started because of the wildlife trade. One possible story about how COVID-19 started is that there was a particular chain of events that led to an animal carrying the virus at a live market in China. Now that is one of a couple of stories people are exploring, but whether or not COVID-19 started because of the wildlife trade, we know that a pandemic can start because of the wildlife trade. We know that when we treat animals that way, when we extract them from the wild, and when we then transport them and keep them in these toxic conditions and slaughter them right in front of humans, we facilitate that spread of disease, okay? So factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade all increase the risk of various health threats, including and especially outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics like COVID-19. Now, some of these industries also substantially increase the severity of human-caused climate change. So consider factory farming. Not only does factory farming increase the spread of disease, but we are bringing into existence lots and lots and lots and lots of new animals, and then using lots and lots and lots of natural resources to use these animals. So factory farming is a major consumer of land and water, a major producer of waste, and pollution, and a major producer of greenhouse gas emissions. This industry, animal agriculture generally, is responsible for an estimated 9% of global carbon emissions, 37% of global methane emissions, and 65% of global nitrous oxide emissions. And that adds up to, on the conservative end, an estimated 14.5% of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very significant percentage of the emissions that are contributing to human-caused climate change. And now part of how factory farming and animal agriculture is contributing to climate change is through its contribution to deforestation and land use. Right? As noted before, factory farming is a major consumer, not only of animals, not only of water, but also of land. And so when you clear that land, not only are you harming and killing animals directly and exposing people to more viruses, but you are also destroying the best way that our planet has to capture and store carbon dioxide in the earth. Forests are amazing, amazing, amazing carbon sinks. They capture and store carbon dioxide. And so when you cut down the forest, not only do you release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but you also diminish our planet's ability to capture and store more carbon dioxide in the future. And that contributes to climate change as well. And now it is worth noting that these are all linked. We really need to emphasize that idea. These harms are linked, okay? So our use of animals is bad for the animals, but then it also contributes to pandemics and it also contributes to climate change. And we need to think about all of this at the same time, because for example, if you only are worried about climate change, then you might start thinking, you know, beef and dairy is a lot worse for the climate than chicken and fish, because cows are way bigger and they emit methane, and you need to clear so much more land to put the cows on the land and then to grow the crops to feed the cows. So since I care about climate change, what I think we should do is reduce beef and dairy and then replace it with a more climate-friendly form of animal agriculture like chicken and fish, right? But then if what you care about is animal welfare and nothing else, you might make the opposite trade. You might think, look, this is all a little bit bad for animal welfare, but actually chicken and fish agriculture is way worse for animal welfare because these animals are kept in truly horrific conditions, and because the animals are smaller, which means more of them have to suffer and die for each meal that gets served to humans. And so I think we should reduce chicken and fish consumption and replace it with beef and dairy, where the animals are larger and at least in comparison, they have better lives. And then of course, if what you care about is pandemics, then you might feel kind of mixed and confused because you think, well, chicken agriculture contributes more to pandemics because of bird flu stuff, but then beef and dairy contribute more to pandemics because of their contribution to deforestation. So I don't know, I'm throwing my hands up. But when we think about it all together, this is when we get the clearest signal that we should be replacing all of this with plant agriculture. Because even though plant agriculture is still harmful, no food system is harm-free, and we need to acknowledge that. Even though plant agriculture is harmful, it causes less harm to humans and animals and global health and the environment all at the same time than these various forms of animal agriculture, especially at scale. So thinking about these topics holistically is extremely, extremely important. Okay, now that, however, is only, again, not the full story, but only part of the story, because when pandemics and climate change occur, they then harm and kill human and non-human animals alike. Non-human animals can be victims of these global health and environmental emergencies, just like humans can. And so let me give a few examples of that. Some will be drawn from COVID-19 and others will be drawn from recent climate change related emergencies. So we know from COVID-19 that when an outbreak or an epidemic or a pandemic occurs, human and non-human animals can be victims. Non-human animals can contract infectious diseases just like humans can. And many infectious diseases can target humans and non-humans at the same time. Many primates are vulnerable to the same infectious diseases as we are. We know from the pandemic that many captive animals did contract COVID-19 and had bad symptoms. Minks were especially vulnerable, not only because we kept them in captivity in large numbers, but because minks are susceptible to respiratory diseases like COVID-19. And when they caught it, they suffered even more than they ordinarily do on mink farms, and the only thing that we were able to do was kill them. This is our solution whenever non-human animals in captive conditions contract infectious diseases. Typically, the kindness that we have available for them is mass culling. So non-human animals can contract infectious diseases, and as the mink pandemic illustrates, non-human animals can then also be impacted indirectly via changes in human behavior, right? So for example, during the pandemic, we did cull millions and millions and millions of captive animals, either because they contracted the virus and we were trying to contain the spread of the virus, or we feared they might contract the virus and we were trying to contain the spread of the virus. Keep in mind, in the human case, we can use things like quarantine and social distancing, but that never occurs to us in the non-human case, in part because we keep them in such large numbers that this is unavailable as an option, right? And then the other reason was there were supply chain breakdowns and unsafe working conditions for humans. Now, often we ignored that and sent humans to work in dangerous situations anyway, but in some cases when supply chain breakdowns were impactful enough, we ended up culling animals for that reason too, not only in farming, but also in research and the entertainment industry and other industries as well. Okay. Now, there can also be some positive effects. For example, when humans are on the road less during social distancing, maybe fewer wild animals are killed by vehicles. Maybe to some degree, wild animals are able to reclaim those spaces a little bit more. Maybe since humans are home more, we can adopt more dogs and give them more affection, adopt more cats and give them more affection, although sometimes also take out our frustration on them and abuse them more. So there are all kinds of mixed effects, both directly because of animals being vulnerable to the virus, and then indirectly because it affected human behavior in a way that exposed some animals to more harm, like when we slaughtered animals by the thousands in even more brutal ways than we ordinarily would, like ventilation shutdowns and smothering and so on. But also in some cases positively, harming them less through vehicle accidents, helping them more through adoption and care. So it's very complicated. Okay. Now, climate change is going to have a similarly complicated set of impacts on non-human populations. First of all, climate change is going to directly affect non-human populations in ways that should already be familiar to us. First of all, it will accelerate biodiversity loss. We are already experiencing about 1,000 times as much biodiversity loss as the historical base rate, 1,000 times more than the historical base rate right now. By the end of the century, it could be 10,000 times as much. We could have lost anywhere from a quarter to half of all species by the end of this century. Right? And we can see some of how that is happening, not only through melting ice caps and rising sea levels and increasing ocean acidity and flooding coastal areas and the increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and so on and so forth, but also again by changes in human activity, including increased human violence against non-human climate refugees. So think about some recent examples of some of this phenomena. 2020, while the world was falling apart in all kinds of ways, one of those ways was Australia was experiencing record bushfires for months, right? And we know that those bushfires not only impacted humans, but also impacted other animals. At least 3 billion animals are known to have been harmed or killed, to say nothing of all the animals who were not counted or estimated, included in that estimate. 3 billion koalas and kangaroos. These are animals who are not equipped to survive this kind of a catastrophe. Koalas, when they sense danger, what do? They run to the top of the tree. Is that going to save them? In bushfires that are spreading for miles, it is not going to save them. And so billions of animals died in this tragic event. There have been floods that in coastal regions where factory farms are contained have killed millions of animals. In 2018, coastal flooding in North Carolina in the United States not only killed an unknown number of wild animals, but killed millions of farmed animals who had no chance to even try to escape because they were held in captive conditions and drowned in those captive conditions. Just this past year, in one region in the world, the Pacific Northwest, there were floods that killed farmed animals who, again, had no way to try to escape, and we had no way to save them. And then months later, there was a heat wave that killed an estimated 1 billion animals, including farmed animals and wild animals. And this is going to keep happening. And then when animals try to escape these conditions, if they can try to escape these conditions, that then exposes them to all sorts of other perils. If they have to leave their home in search of a new home, in search of food and water, that spends energy that is in very short supply. It exposes them to new environmental conditions, new temperatures, it exposes them to new predators, and it exposes them to human violence. So when we increase the risk of weather events that drive non-human animals from their homes, and then they enter our communities in search of shelter and food and water, we do exactly what we do in the case of farmed animals who we call during outbreaks and supply chain breakdowns. We label them invaders, invasive species, and we exterminate them to protect our communities, to protect our economic interests, and so on and so forth. So in all of these cases, the threats that are abusive animals are increasing. Those threats impact us and the other animals, both directly by exposing them to viruses or fires or floods, and indirectly by exposing them to changes in human behavior. We call them pests, and then we exterminate them to prevent the spread of disease, or we call them invaders, and then we exterminate them to protect our economic interests. So this is a tragic cycle that starts the original sin being the violence that we perpetrate against animals, as well as much of the rest of the human economy and the various harms caused in the rest of the human economy. Now, the good news, if there can be said to be good news in this kind of situation, is that I do think that we can change the situation. And I want to spend the final 10 minutes or so of my talk suggesting how. So I think that we can change the situation because we can recognize that human and non-human and environmental health are linked, and that social and environmental and economic justice are linked, both for humans and other animals. And we can pursue health and environmental policies with these ideas in mind. We can include animals in health and environmental policy by reducing our use of them as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts, and increasing our support for them as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts. But it is essential that we do that in a certain kind of way, that we consider animals not only as causes through no fault of their own of these disasters, but also as victims of these disasters and stakeholders in our policies, and that we consider these issues holistically and structurally and comprehensively. So to see what I mean by that, consider some existing health and environmental policy frameworks that I think get part of the way there, but not all of the way there. So we can briefly consider three: One Health, the Green New Deal, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, One Health, the power of One Health is that this is a framework that recognizes the links between human and non-human and environmental health. It recognizes that our fates are linked, and that the more we learn about animal health, the more we can learn about human health as a result. And the more we improve animal health in some respects, the more we can improve human health as a result. And so it encourages us to treat animals better so that we can then benefit from having treated them better. And that is great, but it leaves a little bit to be desired. So one thing is it treats animal health mostly instrumentally. It values non-human animal health mostly for the sake of the benefits for humans, and not really for the sake of the benefits for non-humans. So we need to really imagine a version of this that values human and non-human health for the sake of human and non-human animals, and not merely for the sake of humans. One Health also is not taking agriculture seriously enough. Even though animal agriculture is responsible for animal suffering and death and pandemic and climate change risks, we are not pursuing the right kind of aggressive transformation of our food system under the guise of One Health. At best, we are reforming it at the margins. That is not enough. And One Health is not at all seeking to assist animals and improve their health and well-being in situations where humans are not going to benefit. Okay, so in order to improve One Health, we need to consider animals as stakeholders. We need to be more aggressive about food system reform, and we need to seek out opportunities to improve human and non-human health, whether or not we personally stand to benefit. Okay, now consider the Green New Deal. The power of the Green New Deal, a policy framework introduced in various forms in different countries, but I can focus on the version of the United States. The power of the Green New Deal is that it recognizes that social and environmental and economic justice are linked, that problems like climate change are threat multipliers. Not only do they introduce new threats, but they amplify existing threats that we already face, like housing insecurity and income insecurity and ordinary hunger and thirst and illness and injury and so on and so forth, right? And when we recognize that these crises are risk multipliers, threat multipliers, we recognize that in order to build resilience against these crises, we also have to build resilience against the ordinary threats that they amplify. So if you really want to protect people from climate change, you not only have to protect them against fires and floods, but also against hunger and thirst and illness and injury and the sorts of ordinary problems that are made worse in a world reshaped by climate change. That is a powerful observation, but that observation is currently limited only to humans, Okay, so just like with One Health, the Green New Deal is not pursuing food system reform aggressively enough, and is also not considering opportunities to help non-human animals for their own sake. It might care a little bit about biodiversity, but not about the individual lives and well-being of non-human animals. And now finally consider the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is kind of an international version of One Health plus the Green New Deal. It recognizes that human and non-human and environmental health are linked, and that social and environmental and economic justice are linked. And for those reasons, it seeks broad, systematic reforms of our global economy that can be better in all of those respects. However, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are not aggressive enough even about energy and transportation, but are more aggressive about energy and transportation than they are about food. They barely mention the need to reduce or eliminate meat consumption at all. And they never once mention animal welfare. In all of the goals, all of the targets, animal welfare, to say nothing of rights or justice, it never even comes up once. Biodiversity comes up a little bit, ecosystems come up a little bit, but the lives of non-human animals never come up. Okay, so what we can do is take the important observations that are made through these frameworks, that human and non-human and environmental health are linked, and that rights and justice are linked, and that social and economic and environmental justice are linked, but get more aggressive about food system reform and include non-human animals as stakeholders, not just as instruments for human health and well-being, but as subjects who have health and well-being and merit rights and justice as well. And if we do that, we can unlock all kinds of ways to help human and non-human animals at the same time. And I'll just close by briefly suggesting what I think that might look like. So this is what I think that might look like. The problem, of course, is people say, well, yeah, we care about animals, we care about animal welfare, but this is already so hard. And if we include animals in the mix, it gets so futile, it gets so demanding, futile in the sense that this can never be politically achieved. And even if it is politically achieved, because economies and ecologies are so complicated, we are never going to be sure that our interventions are going to be net positive, right? You change one part of the economy, another part of the economy might adjust in a way that erases all of the progress. Or you change one part of an ecology, another part might change that erases all of the progress. So if this is politically unachievable, and even if we did achieve it, we might do as much harm as good. Why even bother including animals in the first place? And it would be really demanding. We would have to restrict all kinds of human freedoms, like freedoms to eat the foods that we want to eat. And it would be really demanding because we have to allocate all these resources to helping other animals when we don't even have enough to help other humans, right? So those are some good concerns, but here's why I think we should include animals anyway. I think we should include animals anyway, because first of all, including animals is not always futile and not always demanding. There are many low-hanging fruit, positive sum interventions that can be good for humans and other animals at the same time that we can pursue right now that will be politically viable and that will not be especially demanding. And I'll indicate what some of those are in a moment. But second of all, even if it is sometimes potentially futile or demanding, perhaps we should do it anyway. If you run over somebody and you see them injured on the side of the road and you have the power to help them and repair their injuries, should you say, you know, I could help you, but I think I won't help you because for all I know, if I save you right now, you might just suffer and die in some even worse way later on? No, we don't say that because we see you as an individual and we know we have a responsibility to help you now. And we need to extend that same way of seeing to other animals. So even if it might do as much harm as good, we should still try to do what we can. And even if it might sometimes be demanded, we should still do what we can. Yes, we should make sure we can have meaningful lives and we can engage in altruism towards other animals effectively and sustainably. But if we have to give up some freedoms, and if we have to reallocate some resources for the sake of the trillions of non-human victims of our activity every year, then we actually do have a responsibility to do that. And it might feel a little onerous, but changes that are good for moral circle expansion often feel onerous to the privileged individuals who are giving up some of their privilege, right? As soon as you recognize that there are more stakeholders here and we have responsibilities to them and we need to make some sacrifices for them, that constitutes moral progress. We might feel a little grumpy about it because we are giving up some of the joy that we got from treating them like objects, but we have to do it anyway. So it's not always futile or demanding. And even if it is a little bit potentially futile or demanding, we should arguably still do it anyway. Now, here are then some policy changes that I think would be good in the short term for a couple of different reasons. We can improve research and advocacy for food system reform and farmed and wild animal welfare. And we can make sure, especially to do a lot of research about wild animal welfare so we can know more about how to help them in the future. We can then pursue food system reform through informational policies that teach the public about these issues, financial incentives that increase the cost of harmful food systems like animal agriculture and subsidize helpful alternatives like plant agriculture and plant-based or cultivated meats. We can change our education and occupational policies so that we are, instead of training people to be harming animals, we can be training people to be helping animals and doing jobs that are good for humans and other animals at the same time. We can have job transition programs that create public works programs that can hire people into jobs where they can be stewards for animals in the environment rather than harming animals in the environment. And then we can have special targeted programs that allow for just transitions, people who right now need to work in agriculture for income. We can have transition programs that allow them to seek employment in other more humane and healthful and sustainable industries so that we can be making sure not to leave any humans behind, especially vulnerable humans, in our transition to a more just food economy and a more just way of engaging with other animals. Then we can increase social services for other animals, increase funding available for veterinary medicine, for shelters, for rescues. We can have an army of veterinarians ready so that when the next disaster happens, we don't need to just kill animals or let them die. We actually will have more capacity to save them and rehabilitate them. And we can stop blaming animals for human-caused problems. We can stop calling them pests and exterminating them as a first resort. We can stop calling them invaders and exterminating them as a first resort. We can instead seek positive sum structural changes that are good for humans and animals at the same time and minimize the violence that we have to cause them for our sake or for their sake. Now, that is not going to be enough, to be clear. It sometimes is not going to be nearly enough. It might sometimes do as much harm as good. But what's good about these policies, and this will be my closing suggestion, what's good about these policies is they are achievable, sustainable, low-hanging fruit ways of including animals in health and environmental policy that we can start implementing right now, and they'll help at least some humans and other animals in the short term while helping us develop the knowledge and power and political will that we need to help animals more ethically and effectively and at higher scales in the long run. And at that point, we will have to think about more transformative changes too, like basic changes to the legal and political status and representation of other animals. And I'd love to talk about that if you all have any interest. But while we pursue that, for now, we should do what we can. And I think this roadmap is a way of building some momentum, helping some animals in the short term, and putting ourselves in the position where we can eventually make the broader infrastructural and other kinds of structural changes we need in order to build something approximating a just multi-species society. So that's my 40 minutes. I'll stop there, but I raced through it. So I'm sure people have questions or comments or objections, and I'd love to hear them. And so, yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much. That was really inspiring and thought-provoking, and it certainly resonated with me, and certain things I've been thinking about. So there is certainly a discussion going on in the chat, so I'll collect some of the questions. There's a discussion about the use of wild animals by indigenous people. Anat and Ramona especially have been discussing it, and I think it connects to what you were saying towards the end about not leaving any people behind. What happens when there are people that are killing, using them, trafficking, using them for tourism, for food, for cultural practices? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think in general, this is a really complicated issue, and one must approach it with a certain degree of nuance. And this is true not only about indigenous practices, but also about various kinds of, in certain societies, minoritized cultural and religious practices. And the reason why I think this issue is complicated is because I do think that often some communities will be engaging in unnecessarily harmful, lethal, oppressive practices towards non-human animals. But at the same time, I think that there can also be a tendency for mainstream groups to kind of single out minoritized practices for sort of censure or regulation, while leaving alone mainstream practices that are harming animals and public health and the environment at much greater scales. And so while I actually do think that there are, for example, indigenous practices that are worthy of criticism, I am choosing not to focus on those practices in my own criticism, both because I think that the sort of mainstream practice of, for example, industrial animal agriculture is far more harmful at scale to animals and public health and the environment. And I personally have more sort of credibility and legitimacy speaking to those harms and advocating for reforms. So I'm personally choosing to focus on those in my own criticisms. But I am eager for these sorts of discussions and self-criticisms to be happening in every community. And I'm very happy to engage with people and support people who are pursuing those sorts of self-criticisms and moral transformations within different communities. Daphne, you're muted.
Yeah, I just noticed that. The computer told me. Eduardo is asking about the One Health paradigm. So how to overcome conflicts when they occur, for example, zoonoses, from a non-anthropocentric point of view.
So how do we do that from a non-anthropocentric point of view? Yeah. So one view of mine that perhaps not everybody will agree with in this space is that I think it might actually sometimes be necessary to harm or kill animals, for example, in self-defense, or to defend somebody else, or for their own sake, or for the sufficiently greater good. I think that might sometimes be necessary, and preventing a major outbreak could be one situation where that kind of action is necessary. But my general view is that that should be a last resort, not a first resort. We are right now harming and killing animals as a first resort in order to satisfy any human interest or need, no matter how trivial it is. So what I prefer to do is start by seeking the kinds of structural changes, the policy changes, the infrastructural changes that can reduce the risk of zoonoses without having to be violent to non-human animals. And that includes things like ending factory farming, ending deforestation, ending the wildlife trade, and then building new infrastructures that allow human and non-human animals to interact where that can be useful and remain separate where that can be useful. And when we do those things, we can naturally, through these structural changes, reduce the types of incidents, the types of interactions that can result in the development and spread of antibiotic and antimicrobial resistant pathogens like superbugs of various kinds. And only after all of those things have been exhausted and our new army of publicly funded veterinarians are at a loss, only then should we consider any form of violence as a last result in self-defense. And I think in that world, there would be much less need for violence. So that's my general answer.
Okay, great. Marcel has quite a long question. I will try to sum it up a little bit. I hope I don't get it wrong. If I do, raise your hand, please, and you can ask it yourself. But basically asking about the global political structure. And if you think that there might be any effect on that, that there will be an impact on national policymakers and global government and governance institutions. Do you think that is something that might happen in the near future?
Yes, so I definitely think that there needs to be government change at the local and national and international levels. And we can think of more moderate and more radical versions of that. So I mentioned some moderate things that governments can be doing right now. We can be using informational policies and financial policies and regulation and so on and so forth in order to spread awareness about these issues, increase the cost of harmful activities by making them pay for the harms that they cause in society in a way that increases the price of those products, and then subsidize helpful activities using public funds to make plant-based foods cheaper, more accessible, more plentiful. Those are all things governments can do right now. But then we also have to be talking about broader things that governments can be doing, as we are in the climate change arena generally. For example, a big topic in the Green New Deal and sustainable development discourse is just transitions, making sure that as we adjust to better energy and transportation systems, and I would add food systems to that list, as we adjust to these more humane and healthful and sustainable food and energy and transportation systems, we do it in a way that leaves nobody behind, that allows for people who currently depend on these bad systems for food or income, access to alternatives so that they can still have meaningful work and opportunities for, healthful, desirable food. They can still have that, right? And then another example is economic justice, right? We recognize that part of climate justice is a reallocation of resources from the global north to the global south, so that the global north can be taking responsibility for our extra complicity in these problems, and we can be equipping the global south with the resources that they need in order to develop in a more sustainable way than the global north did. And I think all of these lessons need to be learned and applied to this case too. So yes, we do need to be transforming our food system. Yes, we do need, through government action, to be helping wild animals, but we can also be doing it in ways that allow for just transitions, create jobs, and reallocate wealth and deal with some of those human injustices too. And I'll say one final thing about this. Those are the short-term things that we need to be doing. In the medium to long term, we again need to be rethinking the basic assumptions of our legal and political and economic systems. For example, right now we treat animals as objects or property or commodities in our systems. What would liberalism look like if it considered human and non-human rights to liberty? What would democracy look like if it considered human and non-human voices and preferences as part of the democratic process and considered their interests when setting policy? What would capitalism look like if animals were individuals who could own property, like the territory they live in, rather than be property who are owned by us, right? So we need to rethink these fundamental assumptions of liberalism, democracy, capitalism. And of course, we can also be asking if we should be holding on to liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. But I'll say this, either we should replace them or we should at least transform them so that animals are subjects in these systems rather than objects used within these systems.
Great. So Michal is asking about the tendency to label this effort to include non-human animals as a left-wing or a liberal feat, and how to incorporate these issues more into mainstream discourse.
That's a great question. Yeah, there has been an attention and debate in the animal advocacy movement about whether the animal advocacy movement should specifically align itself with left-wing social justice movements, because we recognize the links between human and non-human oppression, and the links and differences, of course, as well, between racism and sexism and ageism and ableism and so on and so forth, and speciesism, right? And once we recognize the links between human and non-human oppression, we might also be able to recognize the links between human and non-human liberation and explore those in a consistent and mutually beneficial way. But then other people have argued that we should allow animal advocacy to remain apolitical, or at least multi-political, because for better or worse, we live in societies that range from progressive to moderate to conservative we all have reasons from within our political systems and cultural and religious systems for caring about animals. And we would be closing ourselves off from a huge segment of the population who might otherwise be sympathetic to at least some of our arguments if we don't allow ourselves to engage in outreach with or welcome moderates or conservatives into our movement to the degree that we agree about certain specific policy changes. So this is an ongoing debate within animal advocacy. Without trying to resolve that debate here, I will say that I see both points. I see the virtue in specifically highlighting the way that animal rights and animal liberation can be fruitfully connected with human rights and human liberation, not in a simplistic and reductive and appropriative way, but just in a way that recognizes the parallels and interactions and shared causes of these oppressions and pursues liberation in the right kind of way. But I also recognize that there are many conscientious moderates and conservatives who care about animals, for example, libertarians, who really do accept that a right to liberty is an absolute right for anyone who has the capacity to enjoy liberty, and that includes humans and other animals. And I think that we would be making a mistake to completely write those segments of the population off and require absolute agreement with everything that we hold to be true in order to collaborate with people on causes where we agree. And so I think for people who are on the left end of the spectrum, allowing for there to be a kind of broad pluralistic movement where you work on the topics that you think are important from the perspective that you think is important, but you do allow some toleration of difference within the movement within certain limits. No active racism or sexism or anything like that, but some toleration of cultural and political difference so that we can benefit from having a broad pluralistic movement with a division of labor and disagreements that can be fruitful because we can learn from each other and we can grow through our disagreements and so on. And striking that balance is always a moving target, but I think a good target to be setting for ourselves.
That kind of relates to what Limo is asking, which is about the scope of this project and how much we want it to be one universal, cohesive attempt to solve these problems, or whether it should be culturally specific or maybe even personal responsibilities. Is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would be satisfied if we all generally agree that these are good goals to be pursuing, and then continue to talk and debate which ways we should be pursuing them, how much we should be finding some unified vision versus exploring different visions. I think for now, probably it is a good idea to explore different ways of implementing these ideas, both because there is a lot of cultural and religious and other forms of difference that make it the case that it can be beneficial to pursue different place-based solutions in different locations, but also because this is a period of experimentation. We still do have those limits on our knowledge and our power and our political will. And part of what we can be doing right now is trying out different ways of coexisting with other animals and seeing which ways work better and worse, and gravitating over time as a human global population to the ways that we've learned through experience work better. And so, for example, if some communities want to try improving animal welfare laws, and other communities want to try extending legal personhood to animals, and other communities want to try creating new legal categories for animals, call them sentient beings, and give them a different set of legal protections, I'm all at present for letting that particular number of flowers bloom, and then seeing where we are in a decade, 2 decades, 4 decades. So I welcome these different approaches and the tension between them right now.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for. I mean, there's some more comments and some more questions. If you would like to send them to the conference's email, we can certainly forward them to you, Professor Sebo. And thank you again for starting off this section in such a positive way. It was really, really interesting. We will now take a 15-minute break and rejoin here to continue our day with a panel on the conflicts and negotiations of legitimizing violence against animals. So thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Yeah.
And we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. This has been great.